The sun was beginning its slow descent over the dusty little town of Dry Creek, casting long shadows across the weathered train depot that had once been the town's pride, but now stood half empty and quiet. On one of the benches tucked away from the main entrance sat a woman who seemed almost like a shadow herself, pale, thin, and weary. Her black dress, once neat, was wrinkled from travel and stained with dust from the road. Her eyes carried the weight of grief and the hunger of a soul that had been both body and heart-starved for too long. She was a widow recently left with nothing but the echo of her late husband's last words and the struggle of surviving each day. She had come to the depot in search of a train that might take her somewhere, anywhere, but the fares were higher than the few coins she clutched tightly in her hand, and her stomach growled louder than the wheels of the freight cart rolling by. Around her, townsfolk hurried past, busy with their lives, sparing her no more than a glance. A hungry widow in a depot was not unusual in those hard times. Desperation was everywhere, but fate has a curious way of stepping into the quiet corners of life. That evening, a cowboy walked into the depot, his boots heavy with the trail's dust and his eyes carrying both weariness and resolve. He had just returned from weeks of cattle work. His hat tilted low against the fading sun, his vest worn but sturdy, and a large silver buckle, gleaming faintly as though it held not just his belt but his dignity. His name was Ethan Cole, a man whose life had been a steady march of lonely meals, long rides across silent plains, and the kind of isolation only the vast wilderness could breed. As he leaned against the depot wall, waiting for a message from the telegraph office, his gaze fell upon the woman on the bench. At first he saw only another traveler, but then he noticed her frail hands pressed over her midsection, the way her lips trembled with restrained hunger, and the way her eyes avoided everyone as if ashamed of her need. Ethan reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth. It wasn't much, just a traveler's ration meant to last him until he got home, but something in his chest tightened as he looked at her. Without overthinking, he walked toward her bench. She looked up quickly, startled, her eyes wide as though fearing he might ask her to move. Instead, he lowered himself beside her, the bench creaking beneath his weight. He unwrapped the bread slowly, deliberately, and broke it in half. He held one piece out to her. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying the deep timbre of the plains. "I reckon you could use this more than I do." Her lips parted, but no words came at first. Hunger, pride, and grief all fought inside her. She wanted to refuse, to show she could manage on her own, but her empty stomach betrayed her. At last she whispered, "Thank you," her voice raw and shaky, and she reached out with trembling fingers to take the bread. She nibbled at it carefully, as though savoring each bite like a precious gift, tears threatening to well in her tired eyes. Ethan watched quietly, his gaze gentle but steady, until she finally looked back at him. For the first time that day, her expression softened, and he offered a small, reassuring smile. "Where are you headed?" he asked after a moment. "Nowhere," she admitted, her voice breaking as she lowered her eyes again. "I don't have enough for a fare. I thought maybe someone might take pity, but folks are busy with their own lives. My husband, he passed last winter. I've been wandering since, looking for a place to start again." Ethan nodded slowly, feeling the sting of her words. He knew loneliness. He knew what it was to want something more than silence at the end of the day. And in that moment, looking at her fragile form and the courage it took just to survive another day, something stirred within him that he hadn't felt in years. He didn't see her as a burden. He saw her as a companion fate had placed in his path. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and spoke with quiet conviction. "Ma'am, I've ridden long enough to know when destiny's sitting right beside me. I don't got much more than a small ranch and a stubborn horse, but I got enough for two. What I don't have is someone to share the fire with when the nights get cold. If you'd stay by my side, I'd make sure you'd never go hungry again." The woman froze, the last piece of bread lingering between her fingers. She turned slowly toward him, her eyes wide with disbelief. No one had spoken to her with such honesty since her husband's passing. She studied his rugged face, the sincerity etched in every line, and for the first time in months, hope flickered in her chest. She swallowed hard, her voice shaking. You don't even know me." Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "Maybe not, but sometimes you don't need to know everything. Sometimes you just know what's right." And in that dusty depot, As the last train of the evening rattled past and the sun dipped below the horizon, a widow who had sat hungry found not only bread but also the possibility of belonging again. That night, the stars stretched across the sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet, and Ethan guided the widow, whose name he now knew was Clara, toward his small ranch on the outskirts of town. The journey was quiet, save for the creak of saddle leather and the soft crunch of hooves against dirt. Clara clutched the reins nervously. She hadn't ridden much before, but Ethan kept his horse close, steadying her whenever she wavered. He spoke gently, telling her about the land, the cattle, the wide open skies that seemed endless. The loneliness in his voice was clear, but so was the warmth that seeped through when he mentioned her presence beside him. When they arrived, Clara's eyes widened at the little cabin nestled against a grove of cottonwoods, its windows